Thank you, Dr. Nitaya, and thank you to our co-chairs, to APAC, and for this forum for having me. I think it's a real pleasure to always talk about pleasure and chemsex especially. And so I wanted to, I just wanted to, actually I don't have anything to start with, I just wanted to say that I think sexual pleasure is something that, I agree with Dr. Bevington that, we haven't talked about it very much. And, I think as like public health people, one thing that I realized as I was sitting through some presentations yesterday is that, we always think the worst of patients, right? And we think the worst of people, when it comes to PrEP, for example, when we are not measuring things for people, we assume that they are not taking PrEP, properly. I think this is something that, I was thinking about as I was, making some final edits to my slide last night, last minute. So, I think, I hope it comes through, in this forum as well. So, I wanted to start off first by thinking about, what is chemsex? I think we assume that everyone might know what chemsex is, but, I wanted to maybe touch a little bit about some of the tensions out there in terms of the definition. And, basically, there's this whole tension between, what is sexualized drug use versus what is chemsex. And, I think sexualized drug use tends to be a more generic or general approach to describing the use of psychoactive substances for the purposes of having sex or in sexual contexts. And the definitions vary, right? Within this region, Asia Pacific, you will find that, some researchers might include alcohol in terms of sexualized drug use or substance use. Some researchers might use or might include amyl nitrites or, poppers as part of that. But when it comes to chemsex, I think it's a bit more, at least typically specific definition. These chemsex involves the use of specific substances such as mephedrone, crystal methamphetamine, amphetamines alongside, maybe like Viagra, other erectile dysfunction drugs, and in specific contexts. Traditionally, some people might tell you that, chemsex is only, when you use technology-mediated kind of hookups alongside, being in the gay, bisexual, and men who have sex with men community. That's what chemsex is, and that's what's been promoted, at least typically. But I think as researchers in chemsex, and I know a lot of people are trying to broaden the definition as well, right? Because I think there is some utility and some use in terms of looking at the use of these substances that typically have maybe higher levels of dependence in terms of the profiles of these drugs, higher levels of so-called risk that are associated with it. But, it's been used beyond men who have sex with men. Other key populations like sex workers, trans women, and, right now we're also considering how cisgender people who are, not part of these typical key populations are affected by chemsex as well. This is something that my team put together. If we look at the prevalence, so-called prevalence of sexualized drug use, I mean, the definition, as I mentioned, is a bit fraught. It's a little bit, debated. But if we included everything, you'll see that I think this reflects where research is happening. I would say, it does not maybe reflect the actual prevalence because we don't have very good representative samples everywhere. But you can see that when it comes to men who have sex with men, interest and the availability of research is across the region in terms of Southeast Asia and Asia. If you look at trans women, for example, you can see a lot of disparities there. So within the chemsex or sexualized drug use research, there are inequalities around this region. And this is a combined figure of both. So when it comes to sexual pleasure, this idea that, we think the worst of people, and I think this idea of the rush to risk, I think it's important to acknowledge. As folks in public health, we tend to think about risk as the first and foremost thing when we're thinking about different kinds of, public health issues or issues that impact us in this space of HIV and AIDS and co-infections. But, I think one thing that a lot of our colleagues who are doing work in critical chemsex and critical drug studies, they're doing really important work because they're there to remind us that risk isn't the only thing that we should think about. And I think as public health professionals and practitioners, we are starting to see, and as Dr. Beverton pointed out that when we incorporate things beyond risk, such as pleasure, we actually reap benefits in terms of not just our understanding of different health issues, but also how we reach people where they are at in terms of giving person-centered care. And in the context of chemsex, what does the rush to risk look like? So, other scholars have talked about how, public health has made important contributions in establishing the link between, for example, methamphetamine use and sexual risk-taking, but the precise nature of this relationship is not defined. When we rush to risk, we have a lot of ungrounded assumptions about how drug use can take hold in these interactions. So it is important to acknowledge that there are public health implications, when drug use is involved, and especially in sexual context. But we shouldn't rush to assume that it is always risky. These are some of the things that people have pointed out, or scholars have pointed out, that we need to sort of consider when we're thinking about chemsex. First is that we need to acknowledge that there is non-problematic drug use. Typically you see a lot of studies. We do not deny that there are certain negative health outcomes that are associated with chemsex that might take place, but not everyone has issues with drugs or dependence. And this is evidence-based. The second thing is that we must reframe the role of drugs in sexual behaviors. We always think about chemsex, drugs and sex, meaning drugs cause us disinhibition, and therefore sex might be riskier. But it really limits the way that we understand sexualized drug use or even chemsex. Not all chemicals are the same. The kinds of effects are different. When people use certain substances are different. And if we overlook how substances are used and in what context, we actually you can imagine if you are trying to do a harm reduction intervention, you're actually not knowing what's happening in this context, and you're trying to roll out an intervention. So that's actually not addressing. It's not a very good intervention from a public health perspective. And we need to move beyond biomedical forms of understanding about chemsex. So, drug use is not just medical, it is not just biological, it is actually social, historical, and political. We do not, it is not just a response to trauma or just a result of social inequalities only. So understanding people's stories and narratives will give us a better sense of how we can actually promote person-centered care and also, center pleasure in our chemsex responses. And there has been research on why people engage in chemsex and sexualized drug use, and this review by researchers at APCOM or working with APCOM have found that when looking at sexualized drug use, including chemsex, these are the motivators in Asia. For example, we know that enhanced and extended sexual gratification and pleasure is one of the reasons. There's also the idea of freedom and confidence to explore sexual fantasies. That chemsex provides such opportunities. There are also what I think are really positive aspects, such as pride and empowerment of people, as well as beauty and social power. These are some things, as queer people growing up, a lot of these things have not been available to us, when we're thinking about our lives in more heteronormative contexts. And the ability to actually have some form of pride and empowerment and the feeling of beauty and social power are also especially important to acknowledge, that these are things that we sometimes can only access when we're using drugs. It also acts as a social and sexual lubricant and forms some kind of community identity and culture. I think that's also really important because, as key populations, as populations who face lots of stigma from the general population, where is our opportunity to build community identity and culture? Where is our opportunity to engage in meaningful social, like networks? Perhaps for some people, especially, when we think about intra-community stigma for key populations, these also allow people to engage meaningfully socially. Especially, research has found that people living with HIV are more likely to engage in sexualized drug use or chemsex. And I'll show you later from some of our participants in the research that we've done that perhaps this is the only opportunity for people to feel free of stigma when they are interacting with other people. And also, importantly, it could be a coping mechanism. And I think this is where we acknowledge that there are certain aspects of chemsex that reflect certain kinds of trauma or some negative implications that people have in their own lives. So how do we look beyond the risk and at the person? I think this is something that my colleagues and I in the region have been thinking a little bit more about. What does person-centered chemsex look like? And this also draws on some of my own personal journey as someone who's been to rehab for chemsex, and also draws on some of the work that we're doing in service provision. So in Singapore, I'm also part of this group called the Greenhouse, and we provide substance use recovery services. And actually one of my directors is also here, Eleanor, sitting somewhere there. Yeah, she's also a director of the Greenhouse and working with me at the School of Public Health. So we can talk to you more about the work that we do after this. But we do realize that for something to be person-centered, we need to address a few different aspects of chemsex care. And the literature has shown that there are different aspects of it. First, we need to look at this journey of chemsex or sexualized drug use. People have different stages of use in their journey. Actually, different people have different relationships with drugs. If we can better understand people's relationships with drugs, what are the motivations to use drugs, you can imagine when we're trying to promote well-being and even harm reduction interventions, we would be able to be more effective in doing so. Second is that drug use happens not in a vacuum, but when it comes to certain events, and when people plan for these events and use drugs in these contexts, can we understand better what happens in chemsex? When we say chemsex, it's just a word, right? But actually, what is chemsex? It involves, starting out, with maybe certain emotions or certain motivations, certain kinds of pathways towards, finding sexual partners, or certain kinds of ways of obtaining drugs. And you can imagine that every step along the way, there's also opportunities for pleasure or risks on the flip side. And the third one is, personal life course. People's life histories play an important role in determining, their relationship with drugs or even chemsex as well. So I'll show a little bit more and focus on number 1 and number 3 in today's presentation. I'll go through them quickly. So when we think about people's relationship with drugs, I think one thing to acknowledge is that if we want to look beyond problematic use, there is also non-problematic use. But I want to go one step further to recommend that we look at this not as a binary or dichotomy, but we look at this as a spectrum. And drug use is a spectrum. And if we're thinking about being serious about person-centered care, we want people to be able to tell us where on this spectrum they are on. I think it would be a failing of the public health system if we do not empower people to understand which part of the spectrum that they are on. Because if we say, okay, fine, we're going to let you decide whether it's problematic or not, and then we just take a step back. Actually, we're setting people up to fail, right? Because we do not empower people with the social support services, the knowledge, and the skills to decide for themselves what problematic means. And I think this is where I also reflect, worldwide, when people say harm reduction services fail, actually this is what's happening, right? The system is not ready for harm reduction, or maybe even things like decriminalization of drugs, and you pinpoint the blame on the decriminalization as the fact that things aren't working. So this is something to consider. This is from the government of Canada. I like this spectrum. So there's also a spectrum of non-use all the way to dependence or addiction. And it acknowledges that use is a spectrum as well at a government level. When we look at research, there have been some reviews to see, what percentage or proportion of drug use is so-called problematic. I mean, the definition of problematic is problematic in itself, but I think when we look at this, there is some work being done. And, when we think about even things like methamphetamine, people do find that the fact that, not 100% of use is already different from maybe what we've stepped in here thinking about. Right? So I think the fact that people do identify that they don't have problematic use is important because it really changes the way that we approach chemsex when we think about harm reduction as well as pleasure-centered approaches. This is a chemsex journey. I think Plateau and colleagues have published this in a journal, and this is what I see as a chemsex journey when we don't have the proper support systems, or when we don't empower people to really look at what chemsex, their relationship with chemsex is. So it goes from loneliness to severe health impacts, but actually this is like the version of it that is the most bleak, right? But I would say that when you have actual services and when you focus on things like pleasure, and when you actually meet people where they're at, you have the opportunity to help people switch lanes. And I think it's important to recognize that that for someone who goes through this journey, you have opportunities to intervene and provide harm reduction services at different stages of the journey. And not everyone goes through this journey. It is not deterministic like that. So that's important to realize as well. And for a lot of people who are doing service provision, psychologists, social workers, counselors, this might be something, or people doing motivational interviewing, this might be something familiar to you. So the trans-theoretical model of behavior change shows that, not everyone is willing to be at a stage for change. They might be at pre-contemplation, contemplation, they might be at the stage of maintaining a certain kind of behavioral change. And what's important to recognize is that if we don't recognize this as meeting people where they're at, our interventions will not work. So are people at a stage where they are willing to accept change? Do we need some kind of motivational interviewing interventions or cognitive interventions to allow people to reach a stage where they're ready for change? And that's when our harm reduction interventions might work. And I mean, some things to consider if there is a dependence issue or if there are some issues when there's risk involved. So, chemsex and intersectional stigma. I'm going to try and wrap this up in 4 minutes. What is intersectional stigma? Chemsex-related stigma, this is my definition, that is co-constituted or reproduced by co-occurring marginalized processes or identities. It is not the same as intersectionality. Intersectionality takes a more analytical lens that is more focused on the individual, as having multiple marginalized identities that, intersect and co-constitute one another to form very unique experiences of disadvantage. But, it helps us to understand that, stigma related with drugs oftentimes are compounded by other forms of stigma based on other marginalized identities. This is a study that we did at the Greenhouse, and Eleanor here is also part of the the authorship list here. And we did this study looking at our clients. And at the Greenhouse and in Singapore, you would imagine that most people are here to seek out services because they've had problems with chemsex. So this is just a disclaimer. And when we look at that, we can see that beyond the positive aspects of drug use, a lot of times people report using drugs and engaging in chemsex as a result of dealing with things like sexual shame, social anxiety, low self-esteem, loneliness. This is that coping mechanism side of chemsex, right? And when we look and dig further, what underpins precipitants. These include different forms of trauma. I think this gives us a lens of the types of stigma that people who engage in chemsex face. And these takes many forms. For example, HIV-related stigma. When we talk to people engaging in chemsex, they say that, chemsex, I won't say it's a need, but when I used drugs, it became the only place where I could be myself as a person living with HIV. Racism is something that people deal with in many different contexts, especially in Singapore too. So because of racism, someone says that not at the moment, under the influence bracket of drugs, I don't care. I just say something nasty back and I just ignore when I deal with racism. So these touch on intra-community stigmas that we need to consider in our services. From the general society, there's also things like homophobia. It's not because I'm gay, that's why I have mental health issues. It's because I'm gay in this society and it comes with certain stresses, and that's why I have mental health issues. In certain contexts, religion also forms a basis for trauma as well. So for this participant who grew up in a very staunch Christian family, he said queer people don't actually have the opportunity to live as themselves when they were young. And this and neglect actually both touch on trauma that is complex traumas. These are not acute traumas that we understand as, for example, violence or encountering war or living through these kind of things. But when you're exposed to these traumas over time, the effect might be the same as going through a war, or the level of trauma and like post-traumatic stress might be reflected in many different negative health outcomes. Sexual violence is something that we have to consider also in the context of chemsex. We've seen that be reported in several studies. And so, these are some things that you imagine when we're thinking about intersectional stigma, we have to address things like HIV-related stigma, things around one's gender or sexual identity, things like sexual violence, and so on. Okay, I've got 30 seconds to talk about what can we do. What can we do here? When we think about intersectional stigma, I love it because actually we published a paper that really thinks about what can we do, so I don't have to say too much. But this is something that I worked with together with my mentors back at UNC Project China, Professor Tucker and Professor Wei Ming Tang. It was actually a review paper. There was an invitation from Current Opinion in HIV and AIDS. And we actually looked at intersectional stigma, social sciences perspective, and how it has implications for HIV service design and delivery. And I think it has really a lot of relevance for chemsex services as well. I won't go through in too much detail, but what I will just summarize here is that stigma is not just an individual construct. We need to measure it at a systems level. We need to integrate intersectionality into HIV services. And we also need to continue mitigating stigma to ensure that we improve uptake of our services. In terms of future directions, it's all there. I won't go into detail. If you scan the QR code, you can read the article. But I think it is paywalled. So if you have trouble accessing the article, you can let me know, and I will send you a non-paywall version. This is my last slide. This is basically putting everything together, and I'm also super inspired by what Dr. Nitaya has recently presented at one of our presentations regarding chemsex, on what IHRI is doing in terms of chemsex harm reduction, a comprehensive chemsex harm reduction framework. And it's also inspired by some of the conversations I've been having with colleagues in the region. We need services that address drug-specific harms, that have social support, mental health, sexual health, rights and legal support. You can imagine how that looks beyond just risks, right? And I think one thing that we need to do in the inner circle is really our principles. It needs to be sex positive, pleasure focused. It needs to be gender or LGBTQ affirmative. It needs to be strengths based or strengths or assets based, because we tend to look at it from a risk or deficit based approach. And it needs to be intersectionality informed. All right, thank you so much.